Wikipedia calls him the leader of a cult, but their own cited researcher disagrees. Let's separate fact from fiction. Bahá'ís Under the Covenant, Leland Jensen is not just a controversial historical footnote. We remember him as a third-generation Baha'i, a knight of Baha'u'llah, and a fearless teacher who devoted his life to defending the covenant. More than that, we believe he fulfilled specific prophecies for the establisher of the Baha'i faith, the one who would clarify the covenant after it had been violated, restore its meaning, and call the world back to the original blueprint laid down by Baha'u'llah, the second Christ seated upon the throne of David. He was a great world educator who just happened to fulfill the prophetic pattern of Scripture. Now, you don't have to share that belief. You may disagree with his claim, his methods, or his interpretations. But if you want to understand why Bahá'ís Under the Covenant take him seriously, you at least deserve an accurate account of who he was and what he taught. And that brings us to Wikipedia. When you go to the Wikipedia article on Leland Jensen, the very first sentence hits you with this. Leland Jensen was the leader of a small apocalyptic cult. That word, cult, sets the tone for everything that follows. But here's an interesting note. The primary researcher Wikipedia relies on, sociologist Robert Balch, didn't use that term. Balch, who spent years studying Dr. Jensen's community, consistently described the Baha'is under the provisions of the Covenant, or BUPC, as a sect of the Baha'i faith. A sect, meaning a branch of a wider religious tradition. Under this definition, early Christianity was a sect of Judaism, not a deviant cult divorced from an established religious foundation. So, from the very first sentence, Wikipedia rejects the terminology of its own preferred authority in favor of the most sensational narrative possible. Now, I want to be clear about something. Rob Balch, whom I've met, is not God. He did academic field work, yes, he gave us some valuable observations, but he also got some things wrong, sometimes in ways that seriously distort the truth. One telling example. In the article frequently cited in Wikipedia, Balch claims the BUPC taught that in the 1860s, a Mormon named George Williams foresaw Christ returning to Montana's Deer Lodge Valley, a serious misrepresentation of both Williams and the BUPC. For Dr. Jensen's students, Baha'u'llah is the return of Christ. That's foundational for all Baha'is. What George Williams foresaw in the 1860s was something different and very specific. He said that the return of Jesus the High Priest, whom the BUPC understood to be a completely different person, would appear in the Deer Lodge Valley. That's no small technicality. It's a core distinction that defines BUPC beliefs. When Balch collapses those categories, it isn't just a casual slip of the pen. He's seriously distorting the belief system he claims to be analyzing. Another inaccuracy is this. Quote, Jensen died unexpectedly on August 6, 1996. Neil Chase has taken the helm, and members seem to be taking the transition in stride. First, his death was not unexpected. he had been diagnosed with congestive heart failure, and weeks before his passing, it was clear that his health condition was dire. Second, any well-educated student of Dr. Jensen at the time would have known that his intended successor was the collective body of the council he had appointed, not a single new charismatic figure. I remember at Dr. Jensen's funeral when one of Balsh's graduate students with whom I was on friendly terms leaned over and asked with a kind of gleam in his eye, "So who's taking over the leadership? Is it Neil?" And my response was straightforward. No, the successor is the whole council. The question itself betrayed an eagerness to fit the BUPC into a familiar sociological framing. One charismatic leader dies, and a new charismatic leader rises to take his place. But that's not the way the Bahá'ís Under the Covenant understand succession. Even the lofty position of the guardianship is not understood to be leader of the faith, but rather the chief executive of the actual leadership of the faith, the true, duly constituted universal house of justice. So when Wikipedia leans almost entirely on Balsh, it's leaning on a source that is useful but not infallible, and then adding its own spin. After branding Dr. Jensen as a cult leader, the article only later mentions in passing that he was a third-generation Baha'i, a knight of Baha'u'llah, a trained chiropractic and naturopathic physician, someone who gave up his livelihood to pioneer distant lands. Wikipedia buries it all under the cult label. And once that framing is set, everything else is forced into it. When Wikipedia addresses the 1957 Baha'i succession crisis, it presents the mainstream Baha'i position as self-evident. When Shoghi Effendi died in 1957, there were no eligible appointees who met the required conditions for successorship, and he died without having appointed a successor guardian. In fact, while Wikipedia portrays this as a straightforward, settled matter, thousands of Baha'is, among them the entire National Spiritual Assembly of France, saw it very differently. Along with Dr. Jensen, they accepted Mason Remy's claim on two clear grounds. First, the Baha'i writings establish the living guardianship as an indispensable institution of the faith, not a removable or optional one. Second, they accepted Remy's reasoning that Shoghi Effendi's appointment of him as president of the International Baha'i Council was an implicit appointment to the guardianship. Shoghi Effendi had identified that council as the embryonic international institution, the earliest stage of the developing Universal House of Justice. And since the head of the Universal House of Justice is the guardian, according to the covenant, Remy and those who accepted his claim concluded that being appointed to its presidency in embryo was, in effect, an appointment to the guardianship itself. So while Wikipedia presents the issue as cut and dry, that framing conceals an entire body of reasoning, evidence, and history that tells a very different story. Next, we come to Dr. Jensen's conviction and imprisonment. Both Wikipedia and Dr. Balsh mention this episode, and each notes, almost in passing, that it was in prison that he came to recognize his mission. But neither account explains how he reached that conclusion, or what intellectual and spiritual process led him there. In 1969, Dr. Jensen was convicted of a lewd and lascivious act involving a 15-year-old patient, and served 4 years in the Montana State Prison. He denied the charges for the rest of his life, maintaining that well-connected professional rivals in Missoula pushed the case forward. Notably, the alleged victim never testified. Instead, the court allowed prosecutors to build their case primarily on the testimony of 3 adult women, a decision many found troubling given that none were direct witnesses to the alleged event. Dr. Jensen even insisted that he had never met 2 of those women. Regardless, the conviction had a profound impact on the development of his religious mission. Wikipedia reduces this to a single sentence. It was in prison that Jensen claimed to have a revelation. No context, no background, no explanation of what he was studying, thinking, or wrestling with. The implication is obvious that his beliefs about himself were subjective and ungrounded. Balch does a bit more. He documents that prison was the period in which Dr. Jensen came to believe that he fulfilled the biblical and Baha'i prophecies for the establisher. But while Balch records the inner experience that convinced him of his divine mission, he fails to place into the record the intellectual and scriptural path that led him there, leaving readers with the impression that Dr. Jensen expected his followers to accept his claims on blind faith. What Balch and Wikipedia leave out is the remarkable constellation of biblical texts that first led Dr. Jensen to consider that he might be the prophetic figure described in Zechariah 3 and elsewhere, including remarkable references to his conviction and even the prison itself. If you want to understand those texts, I recommend watching Establisher Part 6 in the Fireside series on this channel. We'll put a link down below. Now let's talk about the predictions. Wikipedia treats Dr. Jensen's 1980 prediction and a later one almost entirely through the lens of cognitive dissonance. But nowhere does it document that his beliefs and timeline emerged from writings of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi focusing on global upheaval, dire warnings of Mason Remy, and biblical eschatology. In other words, Dr. Jensen didn't contrive the idea that the world was headed toward disaster. He put it all in context. Wikipedia flattens all of this into doomsday prediction fails, group copes. Even worse, Wikipedia mixes Dr. Jensen's predictions with those of Neil Chase, even though Balch is careful to distinguish them. From first-hand experience, I can say this. Dr. Jensen was fully aware that setting dates would expose the community to ridicule. I heard him repeat more than once that failed predictions would prompt the world to laugh us to scorn, but he believed his message needed to reach the widest possible audience, and he recognized that the only way to do that was to attract media attention, and the only way to attract media attention in the 1980s was to send out press releases with specific predictions. He accepted reputational damage as the price of fulfilling his responsibility. Nowhere among all the cognitive dissonance explanations was that simple explanation mentioned. There's more that could be said, but here's the point for now. You don't have to accept Leland Jensen's mission, his interpretations, or even the existence of an establisher. But what you should insist on is accuracy, especially from an institution as influential as Wikipedia. Yes, in theory, its articles can be edited by anyone, but in reality, trying to correct an article often means running headfirst into a wall of anonymous gatekeepers who decide which viewpoints are allowed to be seen and which are not. And that's why this channel exists. If you want to genuinely understand the Baha'i Covenant, the question of the guardianship, and the prophetic claims surrounding the establisher, without sensationalism, without distortion, and without the usual prejudicial filters, then stay with us. Please hit like, share, and subscribe, and go visit schooloftheland.com, where we explore these issues deeply, honestly, and without drama.